Welcome to the scurrychurchofchrist.org. The Bible says in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Please don't let this happen to you. Feel free to contact us at scurrychurchofchrist.org, where you can visit us, and any Bible question that you may have, we will do our best to answer. We are so glad you decided to visit us.
I want you to know you are our honored guest. And I mean that. We mean that. We talked about last week, we called the topic the Shadowing Sabbath. And we went to several passages. And if you would like to look at that lesson from last week, of course, it's on YouTube, and the title is The Shadowing Sabbath. And so we saw that, and when we mentioned the Sabbath, we are talking about when the Old Covenant, they worshiped on Saturday. Paul, you see, the disciples would go in the synagogues on Sabbath, and they would discuss the doctrine. And we're not going to get into this morning, but there are several passages, and we can prove that, of course, that God requires us to worship on Sunday. That's the time that he established in the New Covenant, and that's in, you see that in 1 Corinthians 16, Acts 20 and 7. We can go to several passages in Acts chapter 2 and to show what it requires today. The Bible does say in 1 John to prove all things. And so it's only fair to take the scriptures and prove what God requires of us. And some people wonder why we don't worship on Saturday. And we, again, and I want you to go to Colossians Chapter 2. This is a quick review, Colossians Chapter 2, and see what the Apostle Paul says concerning the Sabbath. And we saw last week that it was a shadow of things to come. And so within that shadow, you see, of course, within the Old Covenant, the Sabbath was included in that. It's talking about the Old Covenant was a shadow. And so you look at Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16, and he says, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. Things, notice what he says, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come. And he says that in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1, when he's dealing with the Old Covenant. Those things were shadow. They serve their purpose, and the Sabbath is included in that. But let's look at that, and this is for us, and God requires, he wants all mankind to be saved, and so this is what he wants us to know. It is a matter of salvation here. And so we speak the doctrine in love. But I want you to, we're here on Sunday morning. I want you to go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Of course, we're here this Sunday morning, and we're here to worship God according to his will, according to his plan. And so, but of course, there's a Saturday, but this is the time of worship on the New Covenant on Sunday. But I want you to see something in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and I want you to look at this. And we're going to go to Exodus. Let's skip to Exodus chapter 31, and we saw Deuteronomy chapter 5 last week, and we saw one reason why God gave the Sabbath, and he gave the Jews rest. And then in Exodus chapter 31, we'll see he gave the other reason he gave the Sabbath. So I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 31. I'm talking, so I'm giving you time to turn to it. Exodus chapter 31. But I want you to see here, we looked at the reason last week, and one reason, and he gave it to the Jews. We saw from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12 to 15. Obviously, he gave it to the Israelites. That was for them. He makes that very plain. And they were under the old covenant. And notice what he says here. Now, after this, we're going to Numbers chapter 15. In chapter 31 of Exodus, in verse 16, he says, look at verse 15. He says, for 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall surely be put to death. And so you look at verse 13, he says, but as for you, speak to the sons of Israel. And so we saw that last week in Deuteronomy chapter 5. This was for them. They were under the old covenant. And he says plain, but as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, you, that's Israel, shall surely observe my Sabbaths. See? For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generation. That's plain. That you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Therefore, you are to observe the Sabbath. For it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. He says, for 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh there is a Sabbath, a complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall surely be put to death. And he says in verse 16, so the sons of Israel shall observe this. See that the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath, to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generation as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and and refreshed. And so he says, when he had finished speaking with him upon Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets. Now remember the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written by the finger of God. Now remember the 2 tablets. And so you see, this is another reason why he gave the Sabbath. But in both reasons, he's talking to the Israelites, and that's why they worshiped on Saturday. And so what I want to see, watch this. Now go to Numbers chapter 15. And so I want you to see here, let's go to Numbers chapter 15. And so notice the penalty for breaking the Sabbath. Now watch. Now he makes it very plain concerning the penalty. He says in verse 15, whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. And so notice the Sabbath came with a penalty. And so he's talking to the Israelites. And so he lets them to know the seriousness of this Sabbath. And if you break it, then the penalty was death. And so notice Numbers chapter 15 and notice verse 32. So God already gives us commandment. We see there last week we saw one reason in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and today we see another reason. Both reasons he's talking to the Israelites. And then when he gives the Sabbath, he also gives this penalty that if you break the Sabbath, you shall die. And so you get to Deuteronomy chapter 15, someone broke the Sabbath. And when God tells them to stone him because that was the penalty, he said that. So look at Numbers chapter 15, verse 32. Now, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. See that? Notice what he says here. Now the sons of Israel. See? Now, while the sons of Israel, it was for them. Were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron, to all the congregation, and they put him in custody because why? He broke the Sabbath. Now he's going to Moses and Aaron. You know, Moses gave the law, and Aaron was, you know who Aaron was. They were all Jews. They were speaking God's will, but they were all Israelites. See, and so he goes to Moses and Aaron. Then the Lord said to Moses, verse 35, the man shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now watch. In Exodus chapter 31, we saw when God gave this law in the old covenant to the Israelites, he also gave the penalty. And so therefore, if I keep the Sabbath, what I want you to see that how if I keep the Sabbath, then I must keep the penalty. I can't have one without the other. They all go together. And watch, I'm going to show you. And I want you to see that. I want you to grasp that before I move on. He gave the law concerning the Sabbath, and do not break the Sabbath, and keep the Sabbath. And so he also gave the penalty to those Israelites who broke the Sabbath. You see here in Numbers chapter 15, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness. So an Israelite broke the Sabbath. And the reason why God says it's stolen because God is sticking to his law. And so anybody who breaks his law of the Sabbath shall die. So therefore, as I logically look at this, if I keep the Sabbath, I also have to keep the penalty of the Sabbath. Well, you say, let's go to Galatians. I want to go to Acts chapter 15 first, and I want you to stay with me. Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15, and then we'll go into the book of Galatians. Stay with me. The Bible says, prove all things. So I want you to see here the issue. This is the issue in the book of Galatians. The issue, watch where we're going with this. The issue in the book of Galatians was circumcision, which is of the old covenant. Notice what he says here. He's going to discuss this issue. Notice in chapter 15 and verse 1, some men came down from Judea, began teaching the brethren, see, that's the saints, the Christians, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, that's your law, you cannot be saved. See? So they're bringing, now he's talking to the brethren, the saints, the Christians of the church, and so these false teachers are saying that if you want to be saved, you also have to be circumcised. Understand what they're saying here. So they're taking in the old covenant. Remember, the Jews had a problem with the old covenant serving its purpose. Many had a problem with the old covenant serving its purpose. Christ said, I came not to destroy it, but I came to fulfill it. And so there's an issue here because even though they believed in being baptized for the remission of sins, and you see they were talking to the saints, they're saying that you also have to be circumcised in order to be saved. It's plain as day. So they're taking a part of the old covenant and they're bringing it into the new, and they're saying this is what you have to do. And now Paul's going to show them what they're doing is not right. Look at verse 5. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed, stood up, saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to direct them to observe the law of Moses. See, the law, now notice the law. Now I told you, don't forget the tablets of stones. And I said, remember something else I want you to remember, the law of Moses. See? So this is during the time of Christianity. The new law has come into existence, and the Pharisees, they're bringing a piece of the old law, bringing it into the new, and saying you must also be circumcised if you want to be saved. So this is the issue in the book of Galatians. Now let's go to the book of Galatians. This is the issue that the Apostle Paul is dealing with. Just to give you an idea, go to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 2. Watch this. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 2. Watch. He says in verse 2, behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. That's the issue. Look at verse 12 of chapter 6. Those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised. See, that's the issue. Simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Look at verse 13. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law. That's the law of Moses. Now watch. Remember the law. Remember the tablets. For those who are circumcised do not keep the law themselves, but they desire to have you circumcised so that they may boast in your flesh. Look at verse 15. For neither is circumcision anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. So the issue is circumcision. Now watch what he says in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4. Watch this. The issue is circumcision. That's what I want you to see. The issue is taking circumcision, which is of the law of Moses, and bringing it into the new covenant, saying you have to be circumcised to be saved. That's the issue. So they're taking they're trying to put the old and the new together, but they're only taking one part of it, and they think that's okay. Watch how he deals with it. But notice what he says before I go on. He says in verse 4, notice the issue here. Watch this. I'm going to read verse 2, 3, and 4. Behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. No, I'm going to show you why. And I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. Watch. So you cannot take a piece of it if you want to. Now remember they said in Acts chapter 15 that if you're not circumcised, then you're not saved. And so they're saying, and what they're saying, that you have to be saved. They're taking a piece, but actually they're saying that in order for you to be saved, you have to keep the law. And Paul is saying, wait a minute, you can't take a piece of the law. That if you want to be saved by the law, then you have to keep the whole law. And that's just not possible. That's why the new covenant came into existence. According to Romans, if the old law could do that, then we would not have, then what need is it for the new covenant, for the new law? Because the old law was not required to do that. The old law in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, was designed to identify sin. In the book of Galatians, it's our tutor. It led us to Christ. But you notice as we get in there in Galatians, when the faith came, then the old law was done away with. And the faith, of course, is the gospel. And so, but I want you to see here what he says. I testify to every man who receives circumcision, see, that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. If you want to keep circumcision, then understand that if you want to be saved by the old law, then you have to keep it, all of it, and that's not possible. But notice what else he says. You have been severed from Christ. You are seeking to be justified by the law. You have fallen from the grace of God. So by adding that one, they said you are seeking to be justified by the law, because you just said that if you're not circumcised, then you're not saved. If those who want to be saved have to be circumcised, therefore you have to keep the whole law, and that's not possible. You have fallen from grace. He said you're trying to be justified by the law. Okay. Watch. I want you to go to Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. So notice we mentioned circumcision was of the old law. And he makes a point. You can't do that. You can't take a piece, just a component of the old law and if you want to do that, you have to keep the whole law. Just can't take one. And so it's obvious from the Bible, he's talking about the old covenant, the law of Moses, the Old Testament. Notice Romans chapter 7, and we'll go back to the Sabbath. And so, but notice what I want you to see here, I want you to get the point in the book of Galatians. Just can't take one. It's not going to work. And so notice we go back to Colossians Chapter 2 and verse 16 and 17. And Paul mentions the Sabbath and was this a shadow? And I just want to say to our friends is that if Paul wants us to keep the Sabbath today, that knocks down his whole argument. He's saying those things were a shadow. A shadow leads to the real thing. So to keep it today, that knocks down, for him to say that will knock down everything. And so that shadow, that Sabbath fits in the category with the O Lord, Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1 and following. Those things were a shadow, which includes the Sabbath. They served their purpose. And we saw last week in Hebrews chapter 4, Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4, that rest, that Sabbath is a Sabbath rest, which is eternal life. We proved that last week. It's eternal life, the final rest. And so the Sabbath rest, that was a shadow. And it leads, see, it served its purpose. And so now we have a final rest. We saw last week the shadow, the Sabbath means rest. But watch Romans chapter 7. I'm going to try to move quickly. If not, we'll finish tonight or next week. In Romans chapter 7, watch this. And so is a Sabbath involved in this? Remember, the Sabbath was one of the 10 commandments. So is the 10 commandments involved in the law of Moses? Paul says, does God take the 10 commandments out of this? It's almost like, yeah, that's the law of Moses over here, but the 10 commandments, we still follow the 10 commandments. No, there are many things we don't follow the 10 commandments, but there are things in the 10 commandments that are all also in the new law, the new covenant, the law of Christ, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2. But I want to show you this. And so notice how Paul he's not going to exclude the 10 commandments. He's going to include the 10 commandments in the law of Moses. It all works together. Watch this. In Romans chapter 7 verse 4, let's just go to verse 4. Therefore, my brother, you also were made to die to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might be joined to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit to God. And so notice, therefore, my brother, you also were made to die to the law. That's the law of Moses, right? Now what? Look at verse 6. But now we have been released from the law. That's the law of Moses, having died to that which we were bound, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit, not in the oldness of the letter. You see, so notice what he said in verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through, watch this, through the law of Moses. He said, no, the law is not sin. And remember, in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, the law identifies sin. It served its purpose. The law was holy, just, and good. It did what God required it to do. I like what he says here. He says, for what shall we say then? Is the law sin? He's talking the law of Moses. May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. Watch this. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Wait a minute. Where did the law say that? In the 10 commandments. Now watch. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, you see it's in the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not covet. Watch. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And so he's using the 10 commandments to make his point. And so he's not separated 10 commandments from the law of Moses. It all goes together. And so when I look at this, he said in verse 7 and verse 4, therefore, my brother, you also were made to die to the law. That includes the 10 commandments. Verse 6, but now we have been released from the law. That includes the 10 commandments. Verse 7, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? May never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. That includes the 10 commandments. How do I know? For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. That's one of the 10 commandments. So he doesn't exclude the Ten Commandments. And so we see in Acts 20 verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Acts 20 and 17, you shall not covet. Doesn't separate them. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I'm not going to look at the clock, and I don't want you to look at either. We're going to move. But 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and I want to show you something, and I will finish probably next week or maybe this evening. But I want you to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And remember what I said, remember the tablet. Deuteronomy chapter, the book of chapter 10. I'm going to read this quickly, and I want you to hold your spot at chapter 3, and I'm going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 10, but I want you to hear this. Notice what he says about these two tables of stone. In chapter 10 and verse 1, and at the time the Lord said to me, cut out from yourself 2 tablets of stone like the former ones. He's talking to Moses, and come up to me on the mountain and make the ark of wood for yourselves, and I will write on the tablets the words which were on the former tablets which you shattered, and you shall put them in the ark. So I made an ark. See that, Moses? I made an ark of acacia wood and cut up 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and went up to the mountain with the 2 tablets in my hand. And he wrote on the tablets like the former writing the 10 commandments. Now watch. Watch this. Let's close with this one. So Paul is going to make a point here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. He's not going to separate the 10 commandments, the tablets of stone, from the old covenant. And notice it says in verse 3, let's skip. Being made that you were a letter of Christ, cared for us, by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, see, that's 10 commandments, but on tablets of human hearts. Such confidence we have through Christ toward God, that not that we are adequate of ourselves to consider anything as confirming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant. Notice this, not the letter, but of the Spirit, not of the letter, that's the old covenant, which includes the 10 commandments, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, that's the old covenant, which includes the 10 commandments, which includes the Sabbath, but the Spirit gives life. But notice this, but if the ministry of death, that's the law of Moses, which includes the 10 commandments, in letters engraved of stone. See what he's doing here, he's taking the law of Moses and he's showing that what happened on the mountain and Moses, when he came down from the mountain, people knew he saw God because that glory was so bright that he had to put a veil over his face. But I want you to see here, before we get into it, we're not going to get into it, I want you to see here that you notice that when he's making his point about the old covenant had glory, but the new covenant has more glory. He's comparing the two, and as he compares the law of Moses, he's using that. Notice what he uses, the stones, engraved in stone, the tablets of stones. He's talking about the 10 commandments. And so when you notice what he says, but in verse 7, but if the ministry of death, see, if the ministry of death in letters engraved on stones, in verse 6, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. In verse 9, but if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of the righteous abound in glory. And so he's comparing the gospel to the old covenant, which includes the 10 commandments, which includes the Sabbath. And as we go on, we see that we ought to be thankful that we are under the new covenant because it has more glory. I like what he says. He said, receive with meekness and engrafted word, which is able to save your soul. And this is why we are worshiping God on Sunday. And as we get into that part of the lesson, we'll go more in depth into Sunday. Because God requires us to do that. Now, why is God saying this? You know what puzzles me sometimes, what hurts me? You can have a heart of gold to help people come to the truth because God desires all to be saved. And then people get offended and walk away and just continue to lose their soul, just lose their soul. That hurts. God is having these things here because he desires all to be saved. And so now that I know that, I see that I don't worship on the Sabbath, but I must worship. I must worship on Sunday. And worship God in spirit and in truth. Then it's like, how do I worship God? How do I become faithful? That's what God is doing. The only way to learn that is through his word. As we get into the second part of 2 Corinthians, you'll see how Paul deals with that, growing in the transformation. If you didn't repent this morning, please do not hesitate. If you're here and you're not a Christian, we will teach you what it means to give your life over to Christ and be added to God's kingdom. What salvation is, because God desires all to be saved. It only comes through the obedience of the gospel. If we can help you in any way, please come out and stand and sing a song for the invitation.